Good evening and welcome to everyone here in Haldeman and the delightfully full group that we have online this evening. I am Dawn Carey. I serve as Senior Associate Director here at the Dickey Center. I work in the Global Health and Development arm of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. I'm incredibly excited to introduce a slightly different flavor of public event than we normally do here at the Dickey Center. Today's talk is our first Mary and Peter R. Dahlman 1951 Great Issues Lecture of the Term, entitled The Politics of Comics, a conversation with Pan Cooke, Robyn Smith, and Jason Lutes. The Dahlman series was created to make the Dartmouth community aware of and motivated to respond to the pressing international issues of the day. Very timely. This is one of my favorite lecture series because the breadth of the speakers that we have here, all under the aegis of our founding vision, it's rooted here in our Great Issues course, originally started by our institutional namesake, John Dickey. The lecture series parallels the broad interests and impact of its creator, who was an alumni of the Dartmouth class of 51, Peter Dahlman, and his wife, Mary. Peter had a very unusual path to Dartmouth, coming to the U.S. at the age of 8 as a refugee from Berlin, Germany. He went on to major in biology and zoology, and then trained as a doctor at Dartmouth and at Harvard. He authored a book entitled Plant Life in the World's Mediterranean Climates, became one of the world's leading experts in the role of dietary iron in development, and later served as docent at both the San Francisco Asian Art Museum and the San Francisco Botanical Garden. In that same wide-ranging spirit and effect, Dahlman lecturers have included dissidents Masih Alenijad, Vladimir and Yevgenia Karamurza, ambassadors Susan Rice and Yorim Benziv, as well as Lori Alvord, class of '89, and the first member of the Navajo Nation to be board certified in general surgery. I feel confident that tonight's lecture continues with those same elements of innovation, dialogue, and social impact. Just a few notes on process before I introduce today's conversation. We'll open for questions from both the audience here and online throughout the hour. As always, I suggest our online viewers type in their questions as soon as they think of them. There's a little button at the bottom that says Q&A to enter those questions. Just a quick reminder as well that Dartmouth and the Dickey Center are committed to free expression and peaceful dissent. With that, we ask you do not interfere with or disrupt today's program. Our goal for this talk is to animate the social justice power of comic books, graphic novels, and the creators who write and illustrate them. As many of you already know, this art and communication form is an effective and accessible way to champion change to a broad audience. Since the early 1940s, study after study has shown that they democratize understanding of social issues and social institutions in a relatable way like no other form. Our three panelists come to this work from both similar and widely different angles, which is kind of wonderful. Our first panelist on the far right is Jason Lutes. Jason was first inspired by bande dessinée, that's French apparently for comics. I did not know that before reading your bio. After a trip to France at age 9. He graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1991, where he discovered comics like Raw and Yummy Fur, leading him to create mini comics under Petty Dreadful series. After moving to Seattle and working at Fantagraphics, he gained recognition with his comic strip Jar of Fools for The Stranger in 1993. Jason later created Berlin, a critically acclaimed series set in the Weimar Republic. Now based in Vermont, he teaches comics at the Center for Cartoon Studies and is working on City of Light, the final book in the Berlin trilogy. It's done?
That's an old bio. Just to be clear, it's all bio.
I get the material. I try to make it a little bit exact. Thank you. How exciting. Cutting news. Finished the trilogy. And a little question I asked each of them, Jason's favorite comic growing up was The Adventures of Tintin, or Tintin, if we're doing French again. On Jason's left, our second panelist, Robyn Smith, is a Jamaican cartoonist known for her mini-comic, The Saddest, Angriest Black Girl in Town, illustrating Nubia, Real One, and Wash Day Diaries, which won the 2022 LA Times Book Prize for Best Graphic Novel. She has an MFA from the Center of Cartoon Studies and was awarded the 2024 Ignatz Award for Outstanding Artist. She loves cake and her cat, Benson. Still true? Okay, now everything's up for grabs, so I want to make sure. And holds on to dreams to returning home to the ocean. Her favorite comic book series growing up was the Archies, and Veronica Lodge was her favorite character.
Thank you.
No judgment here. It's judgment-free. Our last panelist joins us all the way from Dublin, Ireland. A skilled illustrator and writer, he's best known for his social justice comics and illustrations, which have been widely shared across social media. A skilled narrator, he focuses on topics from police violence to mental health awareness. He's worked alongside Amnesty International on several campaigns and frequently collaborates with the activist group Campaign Zero. Pan combines his love of graphic storytelling with a passion for education and advocacy. His debut graphic memoir, Puzzled, came out in 2023, illustrating his personal experiences of growing up with OCD. His favorite comic growing up was Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, perhaps reflecting his goth stage at that point in his life, but we can get into that as well. My favorite comic growing up was also the Archies, and then as it quickly supplanted by the Silver Surfer once I got into high school. But that's another story for another day. Please welcome Pan, Robyn, and Jason. So as we begin our conversation this evening, I want to set an initial tone for what we're going to do. The questions that I've compiled are designed to intentionally and critically take a look at how comics and graphic novels really approach the social justice issues of our day and in the past, perhaps. I'm hoping that each of our panelists answers these not only through the lens of their own experience, but also their understanding of the collective experience of other comic book writers, creators in the space. All that said, y'all can ask whatever questions you want. That's just giving a little tone for mine. And we'll see where that takes us as the hour goes on, shall we? All right, so before we begin, I'd love if each of you could give us a quick short take on how you fell into, or as I said, ran into the world of comics. Not just your initial experiences, but what made you decide this is what you wanted to be when you grew up? Jason, you talked a little bit about your exposure to French comics. Is there a little more there?
Yeah, I think the earliest comics I read were American superhero comics. I grew up in Montana, in Missoula, Montana, and my dad was a pipe smoker, and every Saturday we'd go downtown and he'd buy his pipe tobacco from this newsstand, and they had all these amazing comic books, and I was fascinated by them, so I would spend my allowance on those books. So that was my earliest exposure. And then I think at a pretty young age I decided I wanted to be a cartoonist. Before I could even write, my mom would transcribe the lettering for me. Like I'd draw the pictures and she would fill in the word balloons. And I even drew a picture of myself at age 10, imagining I would be a cartoonist when I grew up, which proved true.
You manifested it.
Yeah,
it
apparently so. Yeah.
It happened. I love that. Robyn, how about you?
I actually, I read, like I said, I read Archie comics. I grew up in Jamaica, and those were really the only comics I had access to because it was like the digests the digests are just like the little square books at the supermarket. And at the time, I was like, well, this is what America's like. It's Archie. And I also thought because this is what America's like, this is what Americans make. It didn't really translate to me that I, as a Jamaican person, would be making comics. But my dad was a portrait artist, and so I was like, I'm gonna go into portraits, and I did. And from there, I just realized I wanted to be able to tell way more stories, because something I love about portraits is capturing what a person is like. but I figured I could do that with more than one drawing. And that sort of led me to sequential art, which then I was like, that's just comics. And then I ended up at the Center for Cartoon Studies, and Jason was actually my teacher. So yeah, that's sort of how I fell into comics.
I love that. What a great segue, actually, to your work. Pan, how about you?
Yeah, I had quite a late start to comics. I read them as a teenager, but there was quite a big gap. And like Robyn, I worked as a portrait painter for a lot of my 20s, but it was a lot of it was more decorative, I like to say, because it was recreating pictures of celebrities for my friends and things like that. But I came very bored of it, and then lockdown happened, and I kind of rediscovered comics all over again, some of the ones from my youth. And wanted to keep doing art, but wanted to do it with more of where I could have my own creative input and more narrative based. So during lockdown, I started a comic diary, a lot of alternative comics and stuff. It's all auto-buy and stuff, so I tried to give that a go myself. But then my life was very boring, as most people's were during lockdown. So I moved to the news headlines and started creating these 6-panel comics of what was going on in the news. Because every day in Ireland, UK, there was lockdowns being lifted and all these different things. So I was drawing that. And then really, when George Floyd was killed, and everyone posted the black tile, I kind of was sitting back, been like, I want to do something more proactive. So I took kind of the same skills I learned from breaking down the news and wanted to learn more myself about other people like George Floyd, and I started with Eric Gardner. And I created a comic just kind of to teach myself, and I've always found visual learning a way that I can take in information more beneficially. I've ended up sharing that to Instagram, which then, long story short, led to me working with a lot of families of people whose loved ones are unfortunately killed by police, also with organisations that work with families, then working with Amnesty International and people like that. So it was quite a whirlwind story, my comics. I got into them very quickly and it all happened very fast. But throughout it, I think I knew from the beginning I started doing those diaries that it was what I really, really wanted to do. And I'm just happy to still be doing it.
I love that. Thank you. That's how I heard about you, was through Instagram initially. So, as we know, comics have long been understood to more or less reflect the social values of our time. Archie comics come to mind right away. I also think sometimes they reflect the cutting edge, the next step of our social values, if that makes sense. How do you think right now, in general, modern comics are doing with grappling with some of these issues? Not within your own work maybe, but maybe of some of your peers. I think of Walt Kelly is one that comes to mind for me back in the day, or Spiegelman. These are all people who were just one step ahead of what was going on. How do you think people are doing with that now? Robyn, do you want to start us off?
I think it's sort of a balance of who is experiencing what, right? So, and what I mean by that is I'm not thinking about too much of the next step in my own work. I really think a lot about what's happening right now. And I think a lot of people who are experiencing life, particularly marginalized people, this is sort of the more political statement that I like to make in my things is how people represent themselves, their community, etc. I don't think they're necessarily talking about the next step. And those are sort of the comics I prefer to surround myself with. So in terms of who's thinking of the next step? So even, I would love to hear more about Walt Kelly in them, because that's not what I grew up reading, like I said. Right now I'm really into indie comics, and there's so much autobio. We kind of talked about this earlier too, coming out of some, different communities, because so many people have more access to expressing themselves, particularly through zines, comics, etc. I think the future, or any sort of political future that's interesting to look at through the lens of comics, has a lot to do with people just stating what it is that they're going through right now. And they don't necessarily have a solution or how we should move forward, or even their own ideas. It's just, this is my exact experience. And I think that's labeling something exactly how it is the only way we can understand something fully, and then possibly move forward. I don't know if that answered your question at all.
It totally does, because I realized the way I was characterizing it was as cutting edge. Somebody else's living experience is going to be cutting edge for me because it's not my norm, and that's something new, right, on some level. Jason, does that reflect some of the things that you're seeing as well with that lived experience piece? Or?
Yeah, oh, for sure. No, and one of the amazing things about our medium is that it's only, it's still relatively young. It's still relatively, I often think of it as like a territory that's unexplored, that we're all exploring, not colonizing. But the medium itself of comics is still full of so much potential that we have not seen tapped yet. And the kinds of stuff that we're seeing now, like there's so much of it now. The whole idea of a graphic novel was new in the 90s when I was making comics, right? It like was coined as a marketing term and then became a thing that made room in bookstores. But now it's just like there's been an explosion of work from people from all strata, and but with a heavy dose of marginalized and queer people making amazing work, talking about stuff that, you know, that's very specific to their experience. And in that way, like our medium is richer, I think, than many other media, because there's also this very strong self-publishing aspect to it, where anybody can make a comic and print it themselves and get it out there. So that's a thing that's very exciting about our field, and the way people's stories and experiences are being communicated like that is really, really great.
I love that. I'm thinking a little bit about Pan's work, and many of your stories aren't your own lived experiences, but what they are is through the lens of the stories of others, these very factual recreations of them. Are we doing enough of that, even if our own lived experiences, I shouldn't say aren't enough, but aren't adding new information to the space? What does that feel like for you? Are we doing enough yet?
Well, see, I kind of look at my comics, the ones where I do anyway, about platform and stories of injustice, things like that, as I take a journalistic kind of approach. They obviously are very far removed from my own lived experience as a white guy from Ireland. But I think their responsibility comes with a platform, and I want to use that platform to tell those stories. I saw another Irish artist speak recently, Brian Maguire, who has created paintings of victims of injustice around the world as a career, and he always says that, like, he's a visitor to these stories, and I think I'm a bit like that as well, where I get to walk away from them. But the thing with social media and the way that I do it is that hopefully when I do, I can leave the people who it affected, like the families, with something that they can continue using, and that doesn't kind of lose its impact, but can be shared over and over again.
So do you work with families who've
I've worked with a number of families.
Like helping to tell the stories of...
Yeah, so an example was Amber Henry, her brother DJ Henry. She reached out to me over Instagram at the start of discovering doing this kind of thing, and it had been nearly 10 years since DJ was killed, and they just wanted to get his story back out there. So I worked with her, and obviously also using news sources just to kind of create a breakdown of what happened and the aftermath. And then when I posted that, it kind of went like Justin Timberlake, Charlize Theron, all these people shared that story, and I think it was read by a couple million people. So like it brought DJ's name back into the light, and their fight for justice is still ongoing. But like to this day, they still have that to keep sharing and to get his name out there. And I just think because comics are such a human narrative, like rather than posting paragraphs of text, or there's a lot of internet activism now, you can kind of show it as like a deeply human story, and I try to center that whenever I tell those stories. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I like how you're asking. You guys are answering it plus, so thank you. Yes, absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about some of the marginalized creators, right? And do any of you think that they've actually reshaped the comic form with this bigger and bigger voice? Do you think more of that's going to happen? If we think about
change the way the conventions of the medium, you mean?
Or the audiences or the applications or anything, all those elements. There's a lot out there that I'm asking, so yeah.
I mean, the answer is yes.
Yes. And if so, how?
I think I think that a lot of these stories getting out are being received so well that they're getting a lot more people interested in the comics. And is it Heartstopper, that graphic novel that's hugely popular and has got a whole new audience into comics and people reading comics, and it just goes to show that these diverse books and from people with specific voices want to be read and need to be read. There's an appetite for that narrative as well.
Robyn, what are your thoughts on that? Same element, or?
I think like when you first asked that, my brain also went to like the conventions of the medium and just how many people are changing. Like something as simple as like leaving out panels. Like there are ways to communicate that are more like interesting to different groups of people just based on like their own sort of like cultural connections,
right?
To like mark making and images, etc. And I think something that I think about a lot is, sure, I was so obsessed with Archie as a kid, but that was just me liking the form of comics. Whereas every like single friend that I've made outside of comics, like all my like Black girlfriends basically are not reading Archie for any reason. Like, and because it's not because they don't like comics, but it's because why would I read this like about these white people? Anyways, and so I just feel like my sort of goal for comics, because I guess I am one of those creators of a marginalized identity, is it's like hard to talk about this objectively when I'm like, oh, I guess I'm just talking about myself, removed, sorry, is I try to make comics that have a lot to do with my own experiences, my friends' experiences, but on top of that, I care a lot about how simple I can make the form.
Right.
I care a lot about making something as accessible as possible to people who didn't grow up reading comics, not only because they grew up somewhere else that comics weren't as popular, but maybe they grew up reading comics that were like just chunks of text about like superheroes, just like these like very muscular white men that had nothing to do with them either, or like their own communities. So making like, I think the way that the form has changed and audiences have changed based on like creators of certain identities creating something, me. I think I prioritize my like audience and myself at the same time. So like, what do I want to read? Like, what do I know my friends want to read? And then making something so personal, it eventually like touches enough people because it's so specific that they're like, oh, this is a very specific story and a part of it I've experienced as well. And then they'll like, I find so many people will come up and be like, oh my God, like, because there's a character in Wash Day Diaries who like, she pulls out the Jamaican flag to dance. And there's so many people who will come like to my table or something if I'm at a convention and be like, that's just like my friend so-and-so. And then they buy the book just for that reason because they're able to like share that one lived experience that they know they've had or their friends have had, et cetera. And I'm just sort of like, that's how I think about like the audience of comics changing because of who's making comics or who's given access to like a bigger platform. Like I do feel really lucky that Wash Day Diaries has made it anywhere because I feel like, not that it's the first of its kind or anything like that, it's a bit much. But just sort of that like, I don't know, someone took a chance on us and we had to prove it first because we kickstarted it like a mini comic. And that's part of like a lot of people's journey making comics, but then also to have like all these identities that aren't super popular in comics, you have to like prove yourself and that you're able to like put this out there and that people want to see it. And we had to prove that first, then come out with this book and then prove that Black girls want to read comics. You know, that was part of it. So
there's 100 things in there I want to pick out bit by bit. So the Black girls want to read comics. Black girls were reading comics and they were reading Archies because that's all there was. There was Archies and Superman and whatever. And so Archies, the girls, for the most part, were looking at Archies. And so now that there's more and more out there, it's like any sort of market diversification. It's like, oh, these people are buying things and they would like that thing to be something that's closer to their experience, right? I don't know if any of you are huge comic book fans, but there's nothing like the anger of a comic fan when a storyline gets altered or there's some aberration in the universe. And when the multiverse Spider-Man first came out on the big screen, people were angry that you had somehow changed the course of how the story should be, right? With that in mind, I go back to the time period when X-Men, which was this really popular franchise, well, actually went up and down in popularity, but popular franchise, they started redrawing all the comics with dark skin, all of the characters being given dark skin. I want to talk a little bit about that. There's market, and then there's appropriation. Is there some sort of degradation of who we're trying to get to buy things sometimes if it's not coming from a person who's representative of that marginalized population? Not so much you, Pam, because yours is more the journalistic, but what do you think on that? That's tricky. I don't want to be part of that either, the cultural appropriation or any of that. Tell me a little bit about that. You're like, nope, don't want to talk about it. How do we avoid those harmful stereotypes in the...
Well, more people who aren't straight white men like me need to make art. We need to give them, platform those people who aren't part of the mainstream paradigm and allow their voices to be heard, and then more and more of the kind of thing Robyn's talking about is possible to happen. The thing about any media that tries to appeal to a certain market segment by changing a character's ethnicity or whatever, if that's not coming from a genuine place or from a person who is of that background, then it's just going to be hollow and ultimately meaningless because it's just a part of the capitalist system. So none of that, no matter how many people make those kind of surface changes, that's not going to really... I mean, representation means a lot, obviously, and if you see yourself reflected even in a really simple way, at least that's something, right? It makes you see the possibilities, but until people from as many backgrounds as possible are making the work, it's not going to just have the real, more deeper meaning that comes with that.
I like that. So it's
Reservation Dogs, that
perfect example.
Amazing show.
Right now.
What's so amazing about that show is I grew up in Montana, surrounded by indigenous people. My sister's adopted Native American, and to see a show that's completely made by, not just directed by, but all the writers and the whole thing, was just astonishing and amazing because as somebody who's not part of that group, it just made the story was just so much more interesting and vital because it wasn't the same old story, just on that base level, you know? But then on top of that, it addresses these really, really specific things particular to that community and those various groups. And that was just super inspirational for me to see that happening. And that's the kind of thing, I just would love to see more of.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, excellent. We're going to pause my questions for a little bit and take a little break. Are there any questions in the audience? Just to start off Yes, please. Someone's going to give you a mic so the folks online can hear. And if you don't mind saying your name, and if you're a student, we'd love to know.
Yes. Hi, I'm Juliet. I am a student. I'm a 28. Obviously, comics are a really interesting form of storytelling, and that it's kind of the middle zone between pure writing or pure images. What, I guess, types of stories would you guys say are best suited to being told through a comic art form as opposed to just words or just pictures? Thanks.
Great question.
I mean, I could teach you, I could give a lecture, and I won't do that right now. Words and pictures come from the same place. Words come from our pictures. We're pictures originally, right? There were pictograms that became phonetic symbols that gathered together, create written language, which we can look at it's like magic. You look at a thing on a piece of paper and speak it out loud and people understand you. Pictures continue to evolve at the same time over, millennia. And comics brings them back together. And they're both such primal forms of communication for us, right? Whether it's handprint on a cave wall or words that we speak out loud. And that's one of the amazing kind of powerful aspects of the medium is that it brings those things together. And as far as what they're particularly good for, I wouldn't want to say anything because I feel like anything is possible. They're good at so much, but you just have to pay attention to their particular qualities, and you could tell any kind of story you want. I mean, there's poetry comics, abstract expressionist comics. They come in all kinds, and that potential I was talking about earlier, to me, means that any kind of story can be told that way. But it does have the particular, the conventions and the drawbacks, the strengths and weaknesses, like any medium. But I will say that they're really good for dreams. Because that weird dream state you get into where like, oh, there's a pumpkin, but its name is Rachel. There's something about comics, the way it combines words and pictures that really works with our deeper unconscious, I think, so that it makes a certain kind of, just by putting things on a page like that, you help them make sense, even if they're like sort of weird and random. So that's just one random thing. Like dreams, I think in particular, lend themselves to being turned into comics, although dream comics are really boring. If there's something particular about comics, it's really good for dreams, but dream comics, who cares about your dream?
I'd say for me, talking back to autobio comics, especially like self-published ones, I could read an autobio comic of someone going grocery shopping or walking to the park, or I'm not sure it would read as well if it was in like a novel format. Like I could literally read an autobio comic that's even scribbled about a guy picking between apples and oranges in the grocery store and be entertained, where I don't think I would react the same in a book format. So yeah, for me.
Love that. Robyn, some of your books, you did the drawing, somebody else did the writing. Tell me about that process, because this is almost abrogating that we're talking. You're drawing about somebody else's dreams in a way.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about that and what that was like.
Well, I think there's something like really so rewarding with finding like a collaborator that you really enjoy like working with. So working with Jamila, who did Wash Day Diaries, was like a dream, whereas working with the writer for Nubia was different. But that's like superhero comics versus like slice of life. And I think to answer your question, I'm so sorry, can you remind me of your name? Juliet. I think there's something so nice, particularly about the genre of slice of life. So like going to the grocery store and watching, there's a difference between like reading what someone is thinking versus watching what someone is thinking. There's something so particular about comics that someone could describe. And then she focused on the orange and like, that's up to the cartoonist, or like if I'm the one writing and drawing it, do I like draw that orange up close? There's so much that I can do to like visually represent this orange that this person is focusing on. Is it like without panels? Is it that like I'm looking at this giant like orange from far away? There's so many ways to manipulate someone's interpretation with an image that I think I could keep describing it with words, but why not just try drawing it? And then that could be paired with text that has nothing to do with it, but we still are then pulling some sort of meaning from the combination of that sentence. This pumpkin's name is Rachel. And then maybe it's not, maybe it is the orange, that could mean a million things. And something else that I find really important about the form of comics is the manipulation of time. And I think there's something really specific about that comics can do that prose can't do, and that like just one still image can do, where like we are watching someone kind of move around, and you also maybe hear their thoughts at the same time. Like I think like that there's something to be said about that. And then there's also the time that you take to look at the book. So you can like go through these pages super quick, or take the time to like stare at one image, move to the next one. And I think that's when you realize that that's the kind of story you want to tell, or that's a way that you want someone to interpret your story, that's when comics is like the way to go.
Do you ever read them twice, the first time through, just to get the story, and then back again? Yeah, me too. And another question from our amazing audience or online. Yes, yeah, just wait for the mic. Perfect.
Hi, my name is Umi, and I'm a sophomore. And with the work that you guys have been doing, especially in consideration of Public Health Week happening right now, like, how do you guys think that, did you guys originally consider, like, how your work, like, with doing these comics, like, how this would be contributing to improving mental health amongst the different communities and populations that these were intended for?
Yeah, so I obviously wrote a book about growing up with OCD, and for me, the goal for that book was that I had OCD for like close to a decade without having any idea what was kind of going on, and that was partly due to OCD being such a misunderstood mental disorder. And I think on average, people go 17 years with symptoms of OCD before even seeking any help. So the goal with my book was especially for middle graders and kids, was to kind of shorten that wait and break down that OCD isn't often how it's depicted of cleanliness or liking things a particular way, but it can be literally specific to an individual. I'm almost certain that I've got compulsions that no one else in the world has. So I think breaking down that, for me, was my goal with my book. Yeah.
Excellent.
I think so. I did the mini comic, "The Saddest, Angriest Black Girl in Town," which was about being isolated in a very small town in Vermont, White River Junction, which is where the cartoon school is. Because at the time when I attended as a student, I was the only Black girl in the town. And so by process of elimination, that made me the saddest and the angriest. And that's like the pitch I always give when someone's like, "Why are you sad and angry?" And I'm like, "I'm not, but there's no one else to compare me to." So if you had to pick out the saddest and the angriest Black girl in town, who's it gonna be? Me. And it was a really sort of cathartic experience of making something. So it was for my own mental health. And I find that a lot of the stuff that I make, it really is just because I'm like, I need this right now. And then from there, I can only hope that because of me needing it and how specific it is to me, that someone else is like, I needed this exact thing as well. Or can pick out, I know I said this earlier, but can pick out those things in the work that I make. So especially being a Black person in a town that there isn't that much racial diversity at all, there are lots of POC who have that experience. And even though they are not the only Black person in town, they are maybe the only this person in town. And from there realize that their feelings of isolation and alone, being so alone in their own experiences, they're able to sort of attach their experiences to what I've created, and then maybe even go on to make their own version of it, or find, there's something so calming about the creative process of a comic that I think that in itself is some sort of form of therapy, and definitely has helped me and my mental health. Because I have a really bad anxiety disorder that has a lot to do with all of that. So I think that's sort of what comics does for me, and the comics that I've made, I hope have done for other people.
Excellent. We talked early on about how comics reflect the social feelings of the day. And that said, comic book artists have often been pilloried or silenced for some of the things they were saying. We talked about Walt Kelly and his work. There were, when he was talking about McCarthy, there were papers that wouldn't publish his work anymore. They've been silenced. Gary Trudeau was often kicked out off of papers for the things he was saying. Have you personally been in any way, you're both all grinning with a little bit, have you had any pushback in that way, either obliquely or otherwise?
I was actually in Taiwan about a month ago speaking on another panel with two other cartoonists. One, Badi, is a Chinese dissident and cannot return to China because of his work. And even further than that, when he sets up gallery shows around the world, the Chinese embassies will try to shut it down. And his family and friends will be called into the police constantly about his work. So when we had our first meeting and they were asking Badi, and then Shabnam as well, an Iranian girl illustrator, also has problems with going home because of her work. And they asked us the same question, and my response was I think the worst was that I think I might have been shadow banned once or twice. So in comparison, not really.
Yeah. Robyn, how about you?
I mean, nothing to that extent. That I feel like it has a lot to do with when you talked earlier about like fans liking things specific. Working with bigger like publishers, there are like moments where people like get really upset about the fact that like everything's woke now and everything is this and that, and so it's mostly like I've gotten like hate mail, and so has Jamila. They're just like, why do you have a problem with white people? I'm like, I don't. But that's like the worst I've also got. It's like I've never felt like I'm in danger. I've never been sort of like told to stay away from anywhere.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
I was on a book tour in Germany 8 years ago, and I was in, I can't remember which town it was, but everywhere I went, I was like talking at a library or university or something, and there was a lecture series that I was a part of, and they got funding in part from the U.S. Embassy. And the guy who organized the event told me that this was during the first Trump presidency, and the new ambassador had just come in, and every year this lecture series got funding from the U.S. government via the embassy, but this time around he had to get everything vetted through them. So he had to submit to them a list of artists and speakers who were coming to talk to get funding for these talks. And what he would do was hobnob at cocktail parties with the various people making these decisions and sort of try to learn ahead of time whether they were going to get funding or not. And he said, can you tell me about, he was speaking to one of the administrators at the embassy, and he said, can you tell me about our upcoming slate, like who you're going to be able to fund or not? And she said, sure, kind of like off the table or whatever. And so he started listing some names, and she was like, yep, okay, fine. And then he said, Jason Lutes, and she said, nope. Which I think is only because, somebody had to do more than a surface read, because my book is about the rise of fascism in Germany. And the American embassy decided that, like the new person in charge decided that that subject matter was not something that they were willing to get behind, which I thought was really interesting. Wow. And I was kind of proud of that. And they ended up raising the money anyway. But so there was like this, that's the only encounter I've had with anybody who came vaguely close to trying to, keep me from saying anything.
And you were surprised?
Yeah, it was surprising that anybody cared. Like at that level, it was like a talk at a library, and you know what I mean? And it's just like an author talking about their book, and the U.S. government decided that was not something they wanted to support, even though year by year they supported the entire lecture series over decades. And I wasn't the only one. Our colleague Tilly Walden was also not not funded for that.
Wow.
Yeah, but as far as those things go, not a big deal.
Wow. Break for audience. Are there any questions online? You can, Noah,
Hi, thank you all for joining us. We do have some online questions. Is it okay if I ask two and then, somewhat related. One person asks, are there challenges with incorporating facts and history with graphic narrative that you've experienced? And another one that's come up is kind of considering the recent surge in misinformation, fake news, alternative facts, all of these things that we see particularly in the US. Do you see a unique capacity that cartoons might have to counter disinformation or be kind of a unique pathway for sharing information that maybe doesn't have the same, people don't have the same reaction to as print news?
Great question. Who wants to jump in? Dan?
In terms of the misinformation thing, I think that is obviously a problem. I think that's down to people sharing it and also just the way social media companies are run. But I've done a few things in terms of, I've tried to do things about dispelling misinformation about abortion bans and things like that. And I've presented it as a conversation with two characters, and I feel that makes things like that more accessible than listing off a kind of a list of all these, this is true, this is untrue, this is not true. So like, I think comics are unique in that you can tell that in a visual language that people find accessible. People who don't read comics, like especially on Instagram, if you can slide across. But you can't edit an Instagram post, and once it's shared. So there is a huge responsibility that comes with a platform like that, because like I've got to obviously be with the stuff that I do, be super, super careful, because they get shared quite quickly. And if I get something wrong, it's a lot of times it's out there before I have time to change it. So I do take that responsibility really seriously, but there's always people who don't. And so I think, it's an important thing to consider.
Can we loop back to the first question with you, which was asking about using historical facts?
Yeah.
Many of the stories you have, you might be contacted by the family of the victims or other, and as you're doing this, what is your process in making sure you've got a fair version of what's out there?
Yeah, like so a lot of the times I will work with the families, and it's great doing that, but it can also be difficult because they obviously, I try to present it as clear and factual as normal, but so a lot of the time I will also work with their legal team, and obviously they have considerations themselves. They don't want any misinformation and things like that getting out, so that makes it a lot easier. Like I'm currently working with Lee Merritt, the civil rights attorney, on an ongoing one, and he'll reach out to me episodically every time there's something new he wants to share. And I think working with people within that profession gives me an element of calm, because I know it's part of their job, it has to be factual. So and it's just then researching a lot, but my factual comics take place a lot of time over a 10-minute span, not as long as yours. so it's a lot easier to get an interaction that takes place over a matter of minutes.
Right.
To nail it down, especially when there is footage a lot of the time of these things happening.
Sure.
I can't imagine something in a longer breath.
That was him handing the baton to you, Jason, I think.
My book's historical fiction, so I do as much research as I can, and it took, it's set between 1928 and 1933. So I don't read German or speak German, so I did a lot of initial research, trying as hard as possible to really immerse myself in the time and place and just really understand the whole context and every little bit of the story, try to find corroborating evidence that if it was an important aspect of the story or something that was based on a real event, I would try to find. Actually, there's a great example of this guy, Horst Wessel, who was kind of a martyr for the Nazi cause. And there's conflicting stories about how he was killed. And he became a kind of hero for the National Socialists. And they would tell one story where he died in a heroic act, and then when you read all the various sources, you learn that he was basically murdered by some communists. He was basically a pimp, horrible person who had this horrible background, and just died a kind of the opposite of a heroic death. And that was just a great kind of microcosm of what it's like to look back at history and try to figure out, try to sort out the postcards from, the handwritten notes. Like how do you, and especially in that time period, it was just so hard to even find photographs of just basic stuff like an alleyway, right? Because it is all just like the big cathedrals and so I just did as much research as I could, did the best job, and then at a certain point when my book got picked up by a German publisher, they hooked me up with a journalist over there who was actually an expert in Berlin history, and he really helped me make sure that everything was... I had a really, really great moment actually where I had a train station drawn in a particular area facing a particular way, and he said, I don't think it was like that then. And then I showed him this map that I had found, and he's I guess you're right. So that was my big moment, but he corrected me on a lot of other things that I think saved me some grief from German readers when I got over there. To the second point, I think what Pan said about accessibility is huge. Like a comic strip, comic book, comic page is so accessible. Sometimes, people generally of older generations sometimes have the medium is difficult for them to engage with, but the combination of words and pictures, if done well, can really draw someone in. Like Pam was saying, I'll read a story about somebody buying groceries, right? Because it's words and pictures together. There's something naturally compelling about that. Mm-hmm. I think that's a great strength when it comes to getting people to read a comic. And as far as the misinformation goes, they're just so hard to combat that. And really, it comes down to me for like talking to actual humans. And unfortunately, that means having a smaller circle of communication, right? But like online, it just seems like most of the time a nightmare. But the thing about comics, generally, not all of them, but one thing that I find very special about them is that it's a very intimate medium. We are all making these things with our hands. Even if we're working digitally, we're using a stylus or whatever, everything you see is something that somebody drew or something that they wrote. Even if they use a font, right? Like, it's still something they assembled together, which is different than a news story or a novel. It's like you're seeing the actual artifact of a person's labor. And I think that like if I draw a black and white comic on paper with a pen, and then I give that to a printer and they turn it into a book, they've taken a thing that was ink on paper and it's still ink on paper. It's like the shortest distance between the creator and the reader. And I think there's something just innately, people can feel that on some level. And I think that's part of the appeal, is that they sense that like someone made this, and that gives it this extra kind of truth, even if you're telling a lie.
Right. So there's that. Robyn?
I don't think I have much to
Well, I was thinking about, it's interesting. I was thinking about how, earlier I said I started following the Silver Surfer, and one of the complicated things about the Silver Surfer is when he was originally designed, he was evil. He was against the powers of good and whatnot, and kind of lives in the in-between the whole time, which is kind of how humans are, if that makes sense, and we're rarely good and evil. And I was just thinking about this person from Germany. If you were never able to find out which was the truth, do comics allow you to surface both realities in a way and have those be parallel threads? Because there's probably a little bit of both, right? And do you get to do that even with your fictional characters, right? Because they're not one-dimensional, right? You get to do both of those sides.
Yeah, a lot of it is, because so much of my work is it's so much about like the personal, and even coming, like I talked about slice of life, and I think that is also like important to like not only storytelling, but just sort of like, sure, we're talking about the politics of comics, right? And like there is the intention of making something to reach someone, to teach them something, but then there's also like the things that I am making are telling people about my life, and my identity is inherently political because I'm Black, I'm gay, I'm an immigrant. Like I'm a woman. There's so many things that like I've just had to live with, and then putting that on paper and then selling it. I'm like, well, you'll remember me in this time, I guess. And I think hopefully the recording of what I'm experiencing now, and like what like my friends are experiencing now. Again, like all of my characters, even though they're all Black women, they're all very different and all like have different lives, that I'm hoping that the reader, depending on their identity, can either be like, wow, that's wild, so many identities I've never considered, or someone who does identify with it can be like, this is what my life is like now, this is great. And so that's more so like how I do what I do or make what I make, and that's like the purpose of why I do. I keep getting distracted from the question, I'm sorry.
There are no bad answers, as it turns out with this, because many of us do not talk about this every day. So everything you're sharing is great, as far as I'm concerned.
I think a lot of the things that I can really just talk about is living and then recording it.
Yeah.
And whether or not that's like fictional, like I'm still somehow trying to mold characters that lived during this time, experienced what we are experiencing, but particularly from their identity. And being a cartoonist, I am responsible for what they look like, what they wear, what they like, and how they do their hair. And all those things came not only from my own personal experience and my friends, but Jamila, who's the writer, we like went through, she made Pinterest boards of like, this is where this person shops because this is how much money they have access to because this is where they work. Like something as specific as that is really important to creating a story that feels real and lived in. And that's kind of like where my focus is when it comes to creating comics.
I love that because you're not introducing disinformation about this lived experience for this person. So it is kind of answering. I'm just going to pull it back for you. Thank you. Perfect answer. Do we have another question? Anybody? Yeah, thank you.
Hello. I guess I was kind of wondering, just because like with Gen Z especially, stuff like TikTok, shorter videos are like what's popular. We don't really read as much. We have shorter attention spans. I don't know, has this affected like the world of comics? Does it affect, I guess, your art in particular? Is it like, not really? Yeah, thank you.
I got TikTok probably a year or two ago because like again like different to them, like the majority, like social media is where like most people know about my comics. Like a very minuscule amount of my people who follow my social media would have read my book and stuff. So I kind of got to keep that going if I want to keep doing comics. But I've posted a few comics there, and like again, like I don't just do socials. When I've started doing a series of kind of like more acts of human kindness, like they're from big acts to like, or people donating organs to people, like just helping people out in grocery stores, because I feel like they're also activism in a way, if the ultimate goal of it is for a better future. Like I think that can be done on the individual level. I'm digressing a bit, but I posted a few of them to TikTok, and the reaction there was like people were reading them. I found, I think people's attention spans are getting shorter, but that just means I put less text in the panels.
How many panels would be in one of those? How long would they be?
Between 6 and 10 most of the time, and it's like you can see a lot of them. Like a lot of them, even I'll just see on like these like huge Instagram pages, like Good News or something, and it'll be like a paragraph of like a story. Like for one, I saw one of this guy called Bill who was doing kidney dialysis, and he got an Uber, and explained kind of his 4 years struggling with it, and his driver Tim Letts turned around and go, "Well, what about me?" He got tested, and miraculously it was a match, and he donated his kidney, and the two of them are still friends. And I finished it with a picture of the two of them, and these comics have such a wide reach that Tim contacted me within 10 hours of the comic being up.
Wow.
So like I saw that originally just as like almost like a tweet, and then I saw it visually as a comic, and then I just made it into a comic. And it's people reading the same story, but I've seen it probably through my lens of my art. I think that's also one of the main things when we're talking about comics is like Stephen King said, like reading a book is the closest thing to telepathy, and then you could write a scene and I could give you, or you could buy a piece of paper and I could implant it in your head through the page. I think comics goes one step further, especially if it's the writer and the illustrator, is that I can give you the scene, but I can also show you how I see it in my own specific art style. So that's the amazing thing. Like it's such a specific way of storytelling that like not only is it the text, but I'm also showing you what's in my head visually. So yeah, that's what I try to do. And back to loop it back in, people on TikTok seem to enjoy it at the same time.
Robyn, how about you?
I think it benefits us for people to have a shorter attention span because they're like, I don't want to read a whole book. Yeah. Oh, wait, this one has pictures.
Yeah,
so I think it's like much easier for them to be like, oh, great, this page has like 3 sentences. And then, I mean, it does hurt a little because I'm like, oh, I spent so many years of my life making this and you read it in half an hour. Yeah. But you bought it, so cool. And that's when hopefully they would go back and be like, maybe I should stop and look at the pictures now.
Yeah.
Second reading, third reading, exactly.
Right. But I do think it like benefits us a little bit that people don't want to like. I remember like for the first time seeing TLDR, too long didn't read, like, or whatever. And I was just like, what is this? And it took me so long to realize that people are shortening texts in the text itself just to be like, I know you probably won't read this chunk of text online, right. So here's like an abbreviation of that. And I'm just like, oh my God, this is where we're at. But then I read the too long to read, because why would I read the chunk? And that's sort of where I'm like, oh great, this book has pictures and words, and now I know everything that's happening, and I've read it like that.
Yeah, I would take that into account all the time when I'm doing comics for online, especially, and the ones that if I'm doing them with the organizations and they're activism based, is my number one feedback to them always is there's too much text in this panel. Mm-hmm. Like this needs to be, there are 3 different panels or change, because Literally people, because you got to remember, like, your readers aren't people reading a book where you're generally at home or you're on a couch. There are people on the train. There's people walking down the street. There's people waiting for a bus. So, like, even encountering a paragraph can be enough to turn someone off.
Yep.
And when you're doing work like mine, where the goal is to reach the end, where normally there's a call to action or something that the reader can do, you need to make it as accessible and take into account that their attention spans are shortening. So you can trick someone into reading a paragraph, but the trick is to break it up over a certain amount of pictures.
Yeah, I guess all I'll add to that is even without the constraint on time or people just reading in a hurry, like when you encounter a wall of text in a comic, because it's not in balance with the pictures, it just catches you up and you feel like, oh my God, I got to read that. But a really good comic for me is one where those two things are working in tandem so that there's just enough words and just enough image to like lead you on to the next thing. And then sometimes upon rereading a really good comic, I think will have stuff there for you. Do you know what I mean? They'll have enough density or richness or subtext that you can actually go back and find something else that you didn't see the first time. It's a very, in Marshall McLuhan terms, it's a cool medium versus a hot medium, right? A hot medium is one that provides all of the sensory input. Like a movie is hot because it's a one-way trip, it's sound, it's color, it's all provided for you, and you just sit there and absorb it. But comics and prose are cool media because it's there for you, but you have to actually step forward and interact with it more actively. You have to choose to read the next sentence. You have to choose to like stop and look at the picture or not. And that aspect of interactivity, when you give the reader that opportunity, it's a thing that you can really take a lot of advantage of. So you can have that kind of surface level stuff that gets the general point across, gets them through the story, but you can also create space for them to spend a little more time or to think a little bit more about what you've just said or what framework you've just set up. Like, I hate didactic works of all kinds, right? Where they say, like, here's a specific message or lesson I want to teach you, and I'm just going to teach it to you. I want the person who wrote that or made that to give me enough credit to be able to, unless, I can imagine if it's aimed at a younger reader or whatever, sure, whatever, spell it all out. But for an adult reader, I just want the room to be able to interpret and find the connections between things. And I think that any media can do that. I mean, cool media like prose and stuff, but I think it's a little less common in comics because the pictures are so compelling. And the main reason a lot of people get into comics is they like to draw. They don't think so much about the words until they have to actually make the comic, right? But then you start thinking really hard about the words, like what's the right level? Like, how long should this sentence be? You can cut those two and it still gets the point across. All those things I think are factors in that.
We are over time, which is amazing because I didn't even notice we were over time until just now. I've learned so much tonight, and you're talking about what the room brings to this. I was thinking about all the questions we got, and did I answer the question to every single thing you shared with us added to my understanding of this medium and the power of what all three of you are doing. And I'm hoping everyone will join me in thanking our guests for this great talk.